What's up everyone? Today in the shop we're going to be deleting and tuning a BMW F31 with the 2-liter diesel engine. This kit's from Rawtek. It's available for purchase on our website at t3-shop.ca, and this is their DPF, SCR, DEF Delete in the straight pipe version. There is a high flow cat, a resonator, and a cat and resonator option available for extra as well. For tuning, we're using Tunezilla located in Surrey, British Columbia. This tune has to be installed by an authorized Tunezilla dealer, but you can remove your ECU, ship it to us, we'll tune it, ship it back to you, and you can install it into your car if you'd like to do this yourself. This F31 was around 100,000 kilometers. There was no issues with the emission system, but removing all the restrictive cats and DPFs will lengthen the life of the turbo. If you're having issues with your DPF and cat, you might see a reduction in power and mileage. Removing all that stuff is gonna wake your car up. It's gonna be a ton of fun again. You're gonna get great mileage. This kit is made with 304 stainless steel, 2.5-inch OD with 16 gauge tubing. It is 100% bolt-on. Everything you need to get rid of your DPF, SCR, and DEF comes in this kit. Stainless steel nuts and bolts are included, as well as all the clamps you'll need to bolt this right into your vehicle. Before we get started, let's take a look and see what kind of tools we're going to need to get the job done. We're going to need a bunch of miscellaneous tools, a trim tool, a bunch of little picks that you'll need for all the electrical connectors, dielectric grease, electrical tape, an assortment of hammers, side cutters, some zip ties, and a pry bar. You're going to need a bunch of different extensions, and for sockets, we need an 8mm, a 10mm, 12, 13, and a 15mm. You're going to need a T25 Torx bit, a T50, and a T60. You're also going to need an E8 E-Torx, as well as a couple wrenches, a 14mm, 22, and a 24mm wrench. Today we're going to be installing the Stage 2 tune from Tunezilla. It's going to get rid of all the lights that would normally come on if you were removing all this hardware. Engine is going to run great, longevity, better fuel mileage, more power. It's going to be awesome. The first thing we're going to do is open up the trunk to get to the battery, as well as unplugging the Selective Catalytic Reduction Module, or the SCR. You're going to need a trim tool to pop off 3 little plastic inserts for the trunk trim. Behind that, 2 of the same plastic inserts for the battery trim, and 2 10mm nuts. Now that we're at the battery, 1 10mm nut to remove the negative post off the battery. I like wrapping it in a little rag just so it doesn't touch the negative post again and reconnect power while doing anything. Next, unplug the SCR module and tuck the harness out of the way. Next, pop your hood so we can remove the ECU. There's 8 T25 Torx screws, and there's 1 hidden along the cowl underneath this weather stripping here. To get the ECU out, there's these big rubber grommets on the wiring harness. Pull those out of the way, pull the whole ECU out and all these fuse holders. Pulling the ECU is a little bit tricky, but there's 2 big ears on the bracket, and then unplug it. Next, we're going to show what has to happen to tune the ECU. Don't worry, you're not going to have to do this. This will be our job, but we're just showing you what has to happen. We unscrew the back panel on the ECU. We have to heat up all the silicone to get it nice and movable, as well as there's a massive strip of thermal paste that we'll show you as well. That is very difficult to remove this back plating on because it's stuck onto the actual circuit board. Right here you see the thermal paste on the ECU circuit board, and it's a ton of fun to remove. Next, we hook up all the appropriate wiring to our Tunezilla tuning box so that we can flash this ECU. During the tuning process, we read your ECU, send the file off to Tunezilla, and they make a new tune for us, and we load it back onto your vehicle so it's going to run exactly how it should. We apply new silicone to the housing of the ECU, put it all back together, and put it back into the relay and ECU box. don't forget to put those grommets exactly where they should be. Otherwise, if you spray your engine down, you're gonna get water inside the box here, which is not gonna be fun. Jump onto the other side of the engine here. We're gonna start on the V-band of the downpipe. You're gonna need a 13mm socket to undo the V-band, and then I use a prick or a pry bar to pry the V-band off of the downpipe and the turbo outlet. We recommend replacing the V-band as well, as when you pull it apart, it starts cracking at the very 6 o'clock, and you'll see later in the video how easy it is to break. Next, unplug the sensors and undo the 2 little hoses for the pressure sensor. Now to get underneath the car, you're going to remove almost all of the underbelly on the vehicle, the plastic and some of the heat shielding. You're going to need a 8mm, a T25, 10mm, and a 13mm for the metal undershield. Next, remove the metal cross brace and undershielding underneath the engine and transmission. Next is a bracket for the downpipe, and there's 2 little coolant hoses that are on here as well that we'll have to remove. Moving on to the reductant injector, it's a tiny little V-band on this injector. You're going to need the E8 E-Torx and either a small pick or a tiny pry bar. I used a hammer as well. Don't worry about breaking this thing. As you see I did here, you're not going to need it anymore. Next, I use a 22mm wrench to undo the sensor that's screwed into the exhaust pipe here. Moving on to the rear brace in the rear section of the exhaust, you're going to need a T50 to remove the front rear 6 bolts and a T60 for 2 bigger rear bolts. Next, you're going to keep removing the underbelly underneath the vehicle, as well as some heat shielding you can see here, some 10mm nuts holding those guys in. We're getting to the bracket that holds on the little modules for these 2 rear sensors. There's 2 8mm bolts holding this bracket onto the body. Undo them, it's going to drop down, and we'll wrap it all up. A couple more 8mm nuts holding these modules to the bracket. Undo them, unplug the sensors, fill these sensor ends with dielectrical grease, and we're going to wrap them up. Spray some of these sensors down where they're connected into the exhaust. They can be super stuck in there, and a little bit of lube goes a long way. This guy is a 22mm socket, and it was stuck on pretty good. Next is a temp sensor in the curve of the exhaust pipe. I just unplug the connector here, and again, throw some dielectrical grease in there and wrap it up with electrical tape so you don't have any future issues. Moving on, I use a 12mm socket to undo the sleeve clamp. It's super crusty and did not want to come off, but it does help removing the exhaust system from the vehicle. And one more exhaust bracket a little bit further back is a 13mm as well. Here you see me wrap up the electrical connectors on the body side of the harness. I'm just throwing dielectrical grease right into the holes of the plugins, wrapping up with electrical tape a couple times around the sides and then once around where the holes are. Throwing this bracket back onto the body of the vehicle and then using zip ties to zip tie all the loose connectors on there so it's all tucked up, nice and neat, and it's going to look good. If you're doing this job yourself, you're going to love all the underbelly and heat shielding hardware. There is so much, but when it's all on there, it looks good, keeps everything clean, and protects everything as well. Next, I'm cutting the OEM exhaust with a pipe cutter. These are super handy if you don't have a ton of room, but a Sawzall works just as good as well, as you see me finishing off the cut here. And finally, we're removing the old exhaust, dropping it down and giving a little twist where that OEM V-band is. It was really stuck in there. Alex had to give me a hand to get it out. And then I realized I left one bolt still on there, so you're gonna need a 13mm socket and a super long extension to get that last bolt out of the bracket, and then you can remove the cat from the vehicle. It's gonna need a good wiggle to get out of there. It's pretty tight space, but there's just enough you don't have to drop the subframe. Next, I'm following the sensor wiring where it plugs into the body side of the harness to unplug it, again filling it with dielectrical grease and electrical tape so we don't have any issues. Here's the hose for the additive injector. I just wrap it up and tuck it underneath the heat shielding so it's out of the way. We have to loop these two coolant hoses that are going to the additive injector. I'm using these hose clamps so we don't lose any coolant. After that, we're gonna use some zip ties and tuck these guys out of the way so they won't be a problem later on. Next, we put the OEM cat in a vise to help us when getting these two last sensors off. Our one smaller temp sensor was super stuck in there, and we actually had to de-pin the sensor to get the closed end of the wrench on there. The small guy is a 14mm and the big sensor is a 22mm. We will be reusing these on the new kit, so really try not to damage these. Next, throw the Rawtek downpipe into the vise and reinstall those two sensors. Here's the old V-band, and you can clearly see how easy it was for me to break. When you open it up and try to close it back down again, it just weakens the metal. We highly recommend you buy a new V-band when you're doing this job. Next, I put the downpipe somewhat in place and use a zip tie to actually hold it in place while I reconnect the V-band from up top inside the engine bay. With the gasket in place, I start tightening up the V-band. I use my fingers to center the downpipe on the turbo outlet to make sure it's perfectly centered and in place. I pull off these two pressure sensor hoses that we do not need, otherwise they're just hanging around not doing anything. And I plug in the two sensors that are on our new downpipe onto the body side harness and connect them into their appropriate places. And I use a couple zip ties to tie down the other sensor plugs that are not needed. Once again, using dielectrical grease and some electrical tape, wrap it up so we don't have further issues. Back underneath the car, we reattach this bracket, and yep, you guessed it, more dielectrical grease and electrical tape. Next up, we're reassembling the exhaust using Rawtek's super awesome sleeve clamps here. All of these joints are slip joints with the sleeve clamps on top, no leaks, and it's really easy to use. Included in the kit is a little bolt and nut, and this is where it's used on the OEM bracket to keep this pipe up. Attaching the next piece of the puzzle here, and we're sizing up where to make the last cut. And unfortunately, I measured once and cut about 3 times here, so don't do that. These pipe cutters are super handy if you don't have a lot of space, but they can be a little tiresome. Another couple sleeve clamps here and the reducer, and our exhaust is almost all put together. These sleeve clamps use a 15mm nut. I use an impact here to snug everything up, and you're gonna have to wiggle things around to get it to be in the right spot and to have clearance against the tunnel as well as that big rear brace. Next, reattach all the heat shielding we removed as well as some of the underbelly. Next, reattach the rear big metal brace, and you're gonna have to make sure there's enough clearance between the brace and the exhaust. I had to twist the exhaust a couple times just to get the angle right so that it wouldn't hit the brace when I'm driving. Moving on, we reattach the metal skid plate here that covers most of the engine and a little bit of the transmission. And more of the underbelly is going back on. There's a lot of hardware that has to get removed for this underbelly. Keep track of where all the bolts go. There's a ton of them. Last but not least, hook your battery back up. Make sure that SCR is not plugged in. Put all the trim back together, and that's it. If you're installing this kit at home and you come into some issues, don't be afraid to reach out to us. We're here to help. Thanks all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.